Northwest Now is supported, in part, by viewers like you. Thank you.
Horizon 637, Seattle Tower, runway 34 right echo, back line up and wait. Traffic is bound 757 on 7 miles an hour, traffic will cross.
34 echo, back line up and wait, Horizon 637.
Track 360, maintain 2000 foot, that was clear the island, approach, reach 526.
615, that's the airplane, 135,
7 Fox 476, down at 12,000 for 15 pounds. After 476, go for the 7 California 350. 350, left 476. The tower, reach 520, good afternoon. 286, Center, Fuel Center, 135, 450. Good afternoon, reach 523, with you, intercept the Bob Boston, runway 34, gears down. 7 land, reach 523. Turn right on Tango, then on Juliet, to cross 124.
Today, we take traveling at 550 miles an hour at 40,000 feet for granted. But when the Boeing 707 was introduced into commercial service by Pan Am in 1958, it was revolutionary. But this airplane flew in the 1940s, the de Havilland Comet. This is the story of the first commercial jetliner, its fall from grace, and a local team's effort to bring one back from the dead. With a decade on Project Comet behind him, Air Force and Space Program veteran Jerry Swearingen says his uncle's story is what got him hooked on aviation.
My great-uncle Charlie worked for the Wright brothers, and he went with them to Kitty Hawk in 1908, and they had the airplane that had to carry a passenger. And so Uncle Charlie, after the Wright brothers had tested their two-passenger aircraft, decided that it was time to put two people on it, and they didn't want both the brothers, and so they had Uncle Charlie ride. He made 4 to 6 flights with the Wright brothers.
More than 100 years now after his uncle's adventures, Swearingen is one of 250 volunteers who toil in this out-of-the-way hangar on Payne Field to save a piece of history. It's a Comet 4C, which spent years in Everett sitting outside, filled with water and rotting.
And this airplane was badly hurt by that because it was parked outside for all this time with standing water in the hull, by the way. And the outside average humidity is about 75% relative humidity, but inside it was in the 90s because that water would heat every day, vaporize, then coat the interior of the airplane, and then when it cooled off that night, that would condense on the interior and run down. So everything in the airplane was soaking wet all the time for about 17 years.
Corrosion severely weakened the plane's structure, ate the metal, turning it into powder, and ensured that the Museum of Flight's Comet, the first Mark IV C model, but the last of the Comet line, will never fly again, which in a strange way actually opens up some nice opportunities for self-taught tinkerers like Bob Morris, who volunteers on Project Comet twice a week.
It's kind of a good news, bad news. The plane will never fly again. That's the bad news. But the good news is because it won't, we don't have to be certified airframe mechanics to work on it. So, anybody who wants to spend some time on it can come up here and help out.
So it could be just elbow grease or a specific skill, whatever you can bring to the table.
Whatever you can bring to the table.
So the battle now is to dry the plane out with warm air to stop it from deteriorating. Back in the first year of the restoration project in 1995, the early cleanup work was probably even dangerous.
All the interior surfaces were coated with a heavy slime. And if you worked in it, and this was before people knew a lot about the health hazards, but your chest would choke up from the stuff you were breathing. You'd have to go outside and take a few deep breaths before you could go back in. We would not begin to do something like that today, but with the knowledge of the time, it seemed the reasonable thing to do. In restoration, one of the big problems is you get incomplete airplanes. Parts are missing and things like that. Our airplane was terribly corroded, but we did have an almost complete airplane. Not a lot of parts had been taken out of it.
So the team had a great place from which to start Project Comet, a groundbreaking plane that got its start in the dark days of World War II. Even before D-Day, the British were boldly planning to dominate civil aviation after the war, led by de Havilland, the company that produced the famous Mosquito. Now, civil aviation was entirely propeller-driven, and the flying public endured a lot of physical discomfort.
There was enormous vibration, which would just be a constant kind of rat-a-tat in your ear, and you would be very tired and frayed by the experience. And it was very loud, but perhaps worst of all was just air sickness was a constant problem for pretty much everybody on the airplane, and with its attendant results. And some of the early models of airplanes, they literally designed them with small little slats or holes in the floor so that after a flight they could hose it down from air sickness and bring the next group on. So it was not a particularly fun experience.
With a big lead in pioneering jet engines, swept wings, and flight control systems still in use today, the British placed a massive bet on jet aviation technology.
So you had Great Britain, which had been knocked to its knees economically by the war, basically deciding that even if it could no longer be the most powerful nation in the world, the sun no longer set on the British Empire and all that, they could still be the most technologically advanced. They could come up with a product that would amaze the world.
Jet travel was the space race before there was a space race, and in July of 1949, the de Havilland Comet roared into the air.
When the Comet started flying, it was kind of a shock to the system. It was almost like a little bit of a Sputnik moment, except that the Brits were our allies, of course, but you had leaders in industry and political leaders and even the President of the United States wondering, how did this happen? Why is Great Britain doing this and why are we not?
The answer lie in America's success building the great prop planes of the era, which actually worked against innovation at a very crucial time.
You had these two great American military manufacturers, Douglas and Lockheed, were sort of locked in this almost death struggle to build the last great four-engine prop liners. They were almost like sort of the ocean liners of the prop era.
Even as the Comet was in final testing, as is the case with all innovation, there are always famous misjudgments, and the American mindset was a long way behind.
C.R. Smith, who was a spokesman for the North American commercial aviation industry, came out in 1952, just when the Comets were about to enter service, saying that the airlines of North America would never fly jets, because his claim was you could fill the fuselage up with fuel and just barely get from New York to the West Coast. He was absolutely right, but you had to do that flying at piston aircraft altitudes. If you went up higher to 40,000 feet, 7.5 miles above the surface of the Earth, it was a whole different world up there.
It was a world of extreme cold and thin air, but conquering that environment changed the entire experience of flying.
So when jet airplanes came in, not only was there this machine where all of a sudden you could fly twice as fast and twice as high as before, but it was the lack of vibration. Now, one of the things that struck me in the research is that even more than the speed, I mean, everybody knew when they got on a jet airplane how fast they were traveling, but if you think about it, you don't really have a sensation of speed when you're in a plane, but that lack of vibration just amazed people. And you could take a coin and stand it on its edge on a tray, and people did that in virtually every flight in the early years of the jet age. It was just such a remarkable thing.
In Seattle, Boeing's Bill Allen took notice. With no real commercial program in place, he too decided to place a bet on jets, even though he was way behind the British.
Boeing, which was a Seattle-based company, had less than 1% of the commercial airliner market. It was a successful military manufacturer, but Boeing, because it wasn't really locked in that battle, decided early on to take a chance, and it got into the development of a jet airliner before Douglas or Lockheed did. But still, when Boeing decided to do that, and Bill Allen, the head of Boeing, finally got the board here in Seattle to commit $18 million, which was a fortune at the time, to developing a jet airliner, that was at a point that over in Great Britain, they weren't developing a jet airliner, they were flying a jet airliner in passenger service.
It was British Overseas Airways Empire Service, with exotic destinations, awestruck crowds at airports, and fawning media attention. It was the future, rendered in shapely aluminum.
The Comet was absolutely remarkable. You know, in a lot of ways, it's a plane that has sort of been lost to history. I think most people don't really know much about it, but when it came out, it really took the world by storm. I mean, you had something that, again, flew about twice as high, twice as fast as the planes before it, and it was really a marvel. It was a thing of great beauty. I think even when you look at it today and the plane that's being restored, it's a very futuristic looking airplane, in a way almost more futuristic than some of the later planes, because the way that they had the engines built into the wing, which turns out to be not maybe such a great design feature, but it made the plane look almost like a paper airplane flying through the sky. You couldn't see what was powering it. And so people were amazed by it, and they signed up for it in droves. It was a huge status symbol to be aboard the Comet, a little bit like when supersonic transport started. That again was seen as sort of the province of celebrities and the very wealthy and powerful.
But no amount of wealth or power could stop the course of history, because there was going to be a terrible, fatal development. Project Comet's airplane is the first 4C model, flying Mexicana Airlines' Golden Aztec service from 1959 to 1970 between Mexico City and Los Angeles.
The most popular model of the Comet was the 4C. Our particular airplane was the first 4C, and it was built as it was common the practice in that time for a given airline, in this case Mexicana, and the whole interior is different from all the other Comets because it was one of the most colorful interiors that was ever put in a Comet. The Mexicans, I think, have this love affair with color, and it's a striking interior as Comets go.
The Comet 4C was the pinnacle of de Havilland's foray into civil aviation. A much better airplane than its Mark I, II, and III predecessors. 18 feet longer to carry more than 100 passengers, with its second-generation Avon engines delivering higher speeds and a 2,700-mile range. For 17 years, restoration volunteers have come and gone, painstakingly restoring, refinishing, or in some cases remanufacturing every important part.
There's a rolling group of people. I have a list in my pocket right now with 84 different names on it of people who at one time or presently volunteers on the Comet. People will come and work on it for a year or two and then go away and come back in 2 or 3 years. And we have one fellow who's doing some wonderful sheet metal work right now who has that kind of history.
Well, I'm a pilot, former airplane owner, interested in aviation. I was an Air Force brat, so I've been around military jets, most of my life. Always interested in aviation and in airplanes.
Bob Morris is a self-taught mechanic, working on cars at first, but then getting hooked on Project Comet.
So this is a great place to come and get exposure to them, get a chance to work on them, get a chance to help restore some of history, especially in this case of working on the Comet. It's a very significantly, historically important airplane.
The Museum of Flight's Restoration Center sits in the shadow of Boeing's 787 production lines, and that provides a huge opportunity for the restoration team to tap expertise in just about every skilled trade required to restore an airplane.
There are a lot of people around here with Boeing who have retired and yet spent their lives working on skills that they aren't using anymore. And this gives them an opportunity to come back and use their skills and also to relate to some of the people that have had careers in aviation and, with whom they have interesting talks and so forth. We have a group of Boeing people that work during the day at Boeing and then come in on Thursday nights and work on the airplane till 10-ish or 10 to 11 o'clock, somewhere in that ballpark, and then go home. And we have sandwiches and we talk and we tell lies, and it can be not exactly entertaining, but it can be a lot of fun.
In 1953, Comet suffered 2 fatal accidents, killing a total of 49 people, both in different circumstances and addressed by modifications to the wings, the control system, and pilot training. So, by 1954, Comet was flying high again. But then, on January 10th, Boeing Flight 781 exploded in flight and plunged into the Mediterranean, killing all 35 aboard.
The Comet, in a way, it was as grievous a blow to national pride in Great Britain as was the sinking of the Titanic. But sort of paradoxically, when the Titanic sunk, even though it was a slower era, a slower moving era, and it was a boat, the world instantly knew. It was flashed on the telegraph lines and the news lines. Everybody knew that the unsinkable Titanic had sunk. And everybody knew that it had hit an iceberg.
But unlike the Titanic disaster or even the previous Comet crashes, this one was a mystery.
The Royal Navy went out and picked up the parts from the floor of the Mediterranean, and I've actually had in my hand the part that failed in that first one and caused the death of the 35 passengers and crew that were on the airplane at that time. It's quite an experience to pick up that piece and think that this crack formed, and the airplane literally exploded at about 35,000 feet of altitude.
A court of inquiry made its best guesses about the cause of the disaster, and de Havilland went about making a few modifications based on those guesses.
Then 2.5 months, it went back into service. BOAC, British Overseas Airways Corporation, made a great point of talking about how safe they felt it was. The head of the airline flew aboard it, and I think a lot of the people who had those tickets felt, well, if it's good enough for the flight crew, it should be good enough for me. Plus, I just want to get to where I'm going. So the plane sold out, and 16 days after it went into service, a third Comet, again taking off from Rome, this one headed for Cairo, rising in the sky, and when it hit a certain altitude, it just exploded instantly, catastrophically, totally killed everybody on board.
The loss of South African Airways Flight 201 grounded the Comet again and launched one of the largest forensic engineering investigations ever conducted.
This was the point at which the Brits conceded that the plane was tragically flawed. Churchill, who had come back as Prime Minister, ordered an investigation that he said, we will spare neither money nor manpower to find out what's wrong, because the feeling still was that this plane, if they could find that flaw and they could fix that flaw, maybe they could still hold on to this lead and they could still be the preeminent manufacturer of this futuristic technology.
A month after the second Comet explosion over the Mediterranean Sea, Boeing rolled out the Dash 80 prototype in Seattle. Then at Seafair in August of 1955, Boeing test pilot Tex Johnston did the unthinkable in Boeing's new jet.
Actually, when Tex Johnson slow rolled it over the race course at Lake Washington, I happened to be there at that time, and so was my wife, and I said, that's amazing to see that. She's why it's just an airplane.
Flying over the hydroplane race course on Lake Washington, Johnston did 2 barrel rolls in the Dash 80. He did those rolls in front of a crowd of reporters, airline executives in town for a convention, and his boss, Bill Allen.
Tex always said that this was a supreme act of salesmanship, that this was a way to show the world this amazing new airplane that was going to change so many things. How quickly we could get to some place, our ability to make choices of the heart were changed by the jet airplane. And so Tex wanted to do something grand and bold that would get everybody paying attention and just kind of amazed. Bill Allen was furious that Tex had done this. He never really forgave him for it. He thought that he had taken this $18 million airplane and had performed one of his old, barnstorming stunts. And yeah, nobody died. It was all that. But Allen still thought that it was reckless and was not sort of in the spirit of the Boeing company.
Allen called Tex Johnson into his office the next day And he said to Tex, "What in the world were you doing rolling the whole future of our company?" And Tex said, "I was selling airplanes." He said, "I had that in a positive 1G roll. Airplane didn't know if it was up or down, and it was a successful demonstration of an airplane." And Alan said, "Okay, Tex, you knew that, now we know that, don't ever do it again."
In terms of the debate, I understand where Bill Allen is coming from on that. I guess I also do feel that it's possible that two things can simultaneously be true, that it was one of the world's greatest acts of salesmanship and marketing, and that it was also kind of a dumb stunt. But both things are true.
The massive investigation into the Comet disasters yielded several problems with materials, manufacture, and design, which all boiled down to a basic misunderstanding of how metal reacts to stress. All the learning eventually resulted in the Comet 4, but 4 years had passed, and in October of 1958, Pan Am with the 707 and Boeing with the Comet both launched transatlantic service. Even with the new Mark IV, flying across the Atlantic was still at the outer reaches of the Comet's range.
Often those flights were scheduled, the passengers bought tickets from London to New York, but the flight plan that they filed with the federal authorities was for London to Boston. And then if the weather permitted, and there were 7 weather stations, ships in the Atlantic, this was before satellites, that were reporting the weather every step of the way, and the pilot was picking his way for the best winds aloft condition and so forth. If they had sufficient fuel when they got to a point of decision opposite Boston, they would divert to their destination of New York City. It was a common practice of that time.
But by then, Boeing's superior airplane was set to win.
Well, it's the same thing of, the guy that, makes the initial breakthrough doesn't know all of the problems he's going to run into. And having made that initial breakthrough, you learn from their mistakes. So the second person into the market typically has the advantage of learning from their successes and their failures, whereas the first company learns from their failures kind of as they're going through the process, and they have to then re-engineer, rebuild, almost start over in some cases. In fact, with the Comet, they almost pretty much did start over with the Mark III.
Because it's a substantially different airplane than the first one.
Yes, it is.
And so is this 4.
And the 4, well, the 3, there was only one prototype built. They went straight to the 4. I think that was a marketing ploy. Let's forget about the 1, put as much distance behind us, the 1, as we can, so this will be the 4.
The impact of airplanes like the Comet is incredible. And of course, the Comet was the first mover in that business, and I think that it really is ironic because the beneficiary of the Comet was Boeing. And it's kind of a tale. The Comet essentially broke the mold for the whole aviation industry, particularly in North America. The Boeing design for that period was much more sophisticated and ultimately more reliable. And if you talk to an airline pilot from that period and say, what did he like? Most of them loved the way the Comet flew. And I've talked to about 5 different people who in their careers, at their end of long careers in commercial aviation, and neither the best or the second best airplane to fly in their careers was the Comet. But if you ask them to compare the Comet and the 707, which are essentially contemporary airplanes, you'll get back the 707 was the better airplane because it was more reliable.
Well, it's compelling because they got so many things right, but there's a few oversights, things that they didn't know. So the things you don't know that usually bite you in the butt. In this case, that's exactly what happened, because not having had planes that were pressurized and depressurized, went up, came down, so many rotations, stressing the fabric, the skin, not having that experience, they really didn't know what to expect. Well, yeah, we love to have people come while we're working on the plane and go through it, because it's one of the few planes you actually can go through. And we take them through the plane and you talk to them about it, you show them the redundant hydraulic systems, you tell them about everything that people learned from this experience. And then the fact that the plane was not a commercial success because of the couple things they didn't know. And that Boeing was able to learn from these things and go on and make the 707 such a success.
In retrospect, I don't think that there was anybody involved with the Comet enterprise, either in the British government or at BOAC or at the de Havilland Aircraft Corporation, who knowingly put a death trap into the skies, but I think they were guilty of a kind of hubris and overconfidence in their plane. They thought they had done it right, they believed in it, and it turned out to be a misplaced faith that they had. It's like getting into a bus these days. We don't really think about it, but it is kind of a miracle when you see a plane roar down the runway and actually, take off. And to the degree that it is an amazing accomplishment, I think one of the most important technological inventions that man has ever come up with, we should obviously understand what the pioneering airplane was and give it its due, even though it was tragically flawed.